Good morning and a very warm welcome to our DGAP morning briefing on geopolitical challenges. My name is Guntram, Wolff, and I'm the Director and CEO of the German Council on Foreign Relations, and I'm really pleased to host this discussion. It's our last discussion before the summer break. It's great to see you all, and I really look forward to our debate today. We will discuss today the situation in Ukraine, the situation in Russia, and the upcoming NATO Summit in Vilnius. And I'm really happy to have a star lineup of speakers today to give us their perspectives on the situation. First, I want to welcome Catherine Belton from the Washington Post. For those of you who don't know Catherine Belton, may I highly recommend her book that was published, I think, two years ago. Catherine Belton's book is called Putin's People, and it's really a biography and really a description of how Putin and his regime evolved and how he really also undermined a lot of the financial system in the West with dirty money from Russia. So it's a fantastic book, highly recommended. And so Catherine is, of course, an expert on Russia. Welcome to you, Catherine. And let me also welcome Nico Lange. Nico Lange is, I think, known to most of you. He is at the Munich Security Conference running Zeitenwende on tour, and he's a former advisor to the former German defense minister Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, and a highly regarded military expert. Last but not least, let me welcome our very own senior fellow, Benjamin Tallis. Benjamin Tallis is an expert on Europe, security, neo-idealism, and he has just published actually a wonderful policy brief on how to shape security guarantees for Ukraine for a period, I guess, after a possible ceasefire. And he will talk about the security guarantees in the run-up to the NATO Summit in Vilnius, where this topic will, of course, be debated. So, without much further ado, Nico, let me start with you. Give us a sense of where the counteroffensive currently stands.
Well, thank you very much, Guntram. Thank you very much for the invitation. Good morning, everyone. I will try to discuss a little bit about the frontline situation in Ukraine. I also published an update this morning, so those who are interested can read into this later. And I think what we all have to understand is that Ukraine is trying to do something that we have no idea how it is done. That's why I would be very careful with military advice to the Ukrainian armed forces at the moment. Attacking in open terrain, very flat terrain, where the enemy can see you if you move 10 kilometers away, without having air superiority against an enemy that has fortified positions, is strong on artillery, and still has helicopters and aircraft flying sorties. This is unheard of in a military way. Nobody has experience with that. And Ukraine is trying to figure out how to make progress nonetheless. This led to a situation where initial fast breakthroughs did not happen. Ukraine tried to achieve them by attacking at night, but the combination of very wide minefields, flat terrain, and especially Russian helicopters made it impossible to achieve the very fast breakthroughs. So now, Ukraine, not having achieved the fast breakthroughs, is moving on to a very slow, methodical approach. And you can imagine it like this. It's a steppe where you can see for miles and miles and miles, and there are minefields everywhere. The Russians are not bad in even laying mines while the attack is going on. So they have mine throwers, mine-laying equipment that is putting new mines into the way of the Ukrainians. So what Ukraine has to do now is to do little attacks at certain elements of the front line. I will show them in a bit. Try to force the Russians to bring out their artillery and their air support, and then one by one taking out the artillery pieces, trying to shoot down the helicopters. Sometimes they are able to shoot down 1 out of 2, and then count the numbers. So it's an approach to slowly reducing the Russian artillery firepower and the Russian air power, and at the same time deep striking with Storm Shadow cruise missiles at the Russian reserves, Russian troop concentrations, command and control. So this is a very meticulous, very slow and gruesome affair. That's why we do not see slow progress. But Ukraine is progressing. I called it today that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is slowly crawling forwards. I think that is what it is. It is crawling forwards, but it's going forward, but slowly. And let's have a brief look. I do not want to be too long, but let's have a brief look.
Let's have a look at the maps. That will be very helpful. Thank you, Nico. Yes.
So just briefly, top down from the north to the south. Starting with the red circle in the northeast. That's the Kupiansk-Sviatovo area. Not really much is happening there, but the worrying situation is that Russia has concentrated very capable troops in the northeast, and we might see a Russian attempt for a relief attack or in Russian offensive operations in that area. Going further down, you see there is the next blue circle, the bigger one is the famous Bakhmut area, where Ukraine has been successful with local counterattacks north of Bakhmut and south of Bakhmut, has taken high ground there, which is favorable, and is slowly but steadily progressing, and the Russian forces in Bakhmut are in a difficult situation. Those are the Russian forces we took over from the Wagner Group, and they are, in comparison, they are weaker than the Wagner Group, and I think Ukraine is trying to use that. The next circle is Avdiivka, the smaller one, close to Donetsk, where Ukraine has also been progressing at the outskirts in the south and now also in the north. So the local counterattacks in Bakhmut and Avdiivka are very slowly progressing. And then you see a few circles in the south, and one that I painted a little bit thicker. That's the main area of Ukrainian counteroffensive. It's south of a place that is called Velika Novosilka. And I think, just to give you a dimension, in 1 month, it's around 1 month of offensive now, since the 8th of June. And Ukraine has on a width of around 20 kilometers, it had achieved a gain of around 15 kilometers in depth. And if you look at this, 15 kilometers, there is more than 100 kilometers to go to the Azov Sea, but there are different cascades of Russian defense lines. It just illustrates what I told you before of how the offensive looks like at this meticulous, very slow progress, trying to save as much material as possible and trying to avoid victims, because, I mean, the only other alternative to that would be to mount a large mechanized attack. But if you are working against an enemy with a lot of mines in an area where everybody can see you, and with the enemy having air superiority, this will be a bloodbath. So Ukraine is trying to do something else. And going a little bit further to the west, there are areas of attack that have been areas of attack for a month now, with very little progress in the Tokmak direction. And then there's the one circle, the one furthest down to the west, around the Energodar nuclear power plant that has been in the news, in Germany at least, very extensively yesterday. And I've just spent 1 second to talk about this in the end. The problem for the Russians at Energodar nuclear power plant is that the river now is very low on water, and there is a very close element where you could easily cross from Nikopol to the other side. So from a strictly military point of view, the position in Energodar is exposed, and Russia will not be able to hold it for long if the Ukrainian counteroffensive continues. And that's why we are having this discussion now. The Ukrainians, and I think they have good reasons, they believe that Russia will have a scorched earth approach and have heavy destructions at Energodar nuclear power plant if they have to leave. And at the same time, the Russians are trying to mobilize us and other supporters of Ukraine by telling the story that Ukraine is shelling the power plant to maybe force Ukraine or put pressure on Ukraine not to continue with the counteroffensive into that direction. That's why we are having this discussion. I'm pretty relaxed about this because Energodar is not Chernobyl, and you cannot start a nuclear catastrophe by blowing something up there or by just shelling it. I know that everybody has this fear, but it's impossible. But I think what can be achieved by Russia is destroying the turbines so that this power plant is not usable for a long period of time. And that is for Ukrainian recovery and the Ukrainian economy. It's bad news because east of the Dnipro, the nuclear power station at Energodar, I think, has been supplying 30% of all energy, especially for industry. So the destruction of the turbines would be a blow to the Ukrainian economy. I leave it here. Thank you very much.
We ran a little bit over our planned time here, but I think that was okay because we wanted to see the maps and get all the details of the counter-offensive. And of course, overall a picture that is not as nice as we would like it to be. But I think you described really well the difficulties of moving ahead and, the difficulties, especially in open terrain with mines and no air superiorities. So this is clearly a very, very difficult operation for Ukraine. Now let's turn to Catherine. Catherine, a lot has happened in Russia. Give us a sense where you see the political situation currently.
No, obviously, since the momentous events of just over a week ago, things have calmed down quite a bit in Russia. Since then, the Kremlin's PR machine has essentially gone into overdrive, and we've seen all these images of Putin trying to patch up his image, greeting adoring crowds in Dagestan, and even kissing a young 8-year-old girl who came to visit him in his office in his Kremlin. He gave her flowers and had her sit in his chair in the Kremlin. They're really trying to make him look like the father of the nation, but the cracks are really not very far away. This is all very much just on the surface. And on the day of Prigozhin's armed rebellion, I was speaking with one official who has very good connections in Russian diplomatic circles. In fact, he's a member of Russian diplomatic circles, and he said, look, what's going on with Prigozhin now is part of a conflict within the ruling elite that's been going on for a long time. There are a lot of differences of opinion over how the so-called special military operation, as he called it, we would call it war, is conducted. And there are a lot of differences of opinion over how the country should be run in terms of policy and economics. And he said, unfortunately, what we're seeing today is this conflict completely breaking out into the open, into an armed rebellion. So these differences in opinion have not gone anywhere, even though Prigozhin turned his men away from Moscow and they didn't march all the way to the capital. And we can still see the cracks now because, despite Putin vowing to put down and crush this armed rebellion, of course he didn't. And, he allowed Prigozhin's men to get nearly 200 kilometers away from Moscow. They faced very little resistance. And he also, in the end, rather than face a bloody battle in Moscow, he allowed Prigozhin and his men an escape route to Belarus, where they can continue to run the Wagner mercenary group. Of course, there are no criminal charges now against him. We saw even yesterday these rather lax attitudes towards Prigozhin because he turned up in St. Petersburg, where he received back the $111 million in cash that the FSB had seized from his home when they raided it over the weekend of the armed rebellion. He was also, I'm told by one St. Petersburg businessman, given back his Glock pistol that had been awarded to him for bravery. So, he's still functioning. Of course, he's facing pressure, but mainly on the PR side, the Kremlin is now trying to paint him as an ogre, whereas Putin is the savior of the nation who's saved the country from civil war. But we still see the political aftershocks of this. It can be most clearly seen now in kind of the impact on the ruble rate. Basically, over the weekend of the armed rebellion, a lot of members of the elite and a lot of middle class people were kind of panicking. They were trying to get cash out of ATM machines. Everyone wanted to buy hard currency, and this is still having an after effect on the ruble. In the days since the rebellion, it's fallen 6 rubles to the dollar. People are wondering whether it could fall to 100 rubles to the dollar in the near term, and this is also going to put pressure on household pockets, because there are still imports coming into the country, even if they're from China and Turkey, and they are going to start costing more. This is a real blow to Putin's image, despite the Kremlin PR drive. They're trying to put a lid on it, but particularly for the elite, it was really the emperor has no clothes moment for them. Putin has always led his country through conveying this image as a strongman leader. And as one Russian businessman to me, he said basically Russia is like a mafia country. If you're going to be the boss of it, you have to show that you're the toughest boss. And now that's no longer the case. And in the regions in particular, the regional bosses might have their perception of Putin seems to have very strongly fallen. Of course, we have the Levada poll recently conducted a poll since the armed rebellion, and that shows support for Putin is still pretty high, around 80%. But Medusa, the independent investigative outlet, cited confidential polling conducted by the Kremlin, which showed that in some regions the trust in Putin has fallen up to 14%. So there are still a lot of questions about how this happened. People are still wondering, did Putin momentarily lose control of the country? We still don't know how it was that Prigozhin and his men were able to take control of the main command center for the military operation in Ukraine, in Rostov, without a shot being fired. This sort of indicates that there was an inside element. It was an inside job. Did the commander of the army, Surovikin, who is very much Prigozhin's side, did he sort of give a waiver for Prigozhin's men to just walk into Rostov and take over the command facilities? No one knows what's happened to Surovikin. He still hasn't been seen since that weekend. And we still don't know whether the elite is going to acquiesce and or whether this type of uprising can happen again. I guess the doves in the Kremlin are hoping that essentially the Kremlin PR drive has worked and is going to work. They're very much looking at the Ukrainian counteroffensive as being decisive now in deciding how things play out. They're very much hoping that because Russia has had so much time to dig in its defenses and lay these minefields that Nico was describing, that essentially they can continue to drag the war out, that Western support will fade. One Russian businessman said they're still hoping essentially for a Korean-style solution in which various buffer zones are created in Ukraine and Russia essentially gets to freeze the conflict. But of course, as we all know, that's dangerous because the more hawkish elements around Putin will try to use this pause in operations to come back and take more land eventually. Wonderful. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I mean, perhaps just one very quick word on how you see the stability of the Putin regime. I mean, you said he's weakened, but at the same time, he, of course, now knows who was with him and who was against him. And he knows that he has to show that he's the bad and the worst guy and the toughest guy in town. So isn't that a moment where he would actually step up and be even more brutal and perhaps do even more crazy things just to reestablish his leadership? And perhaps is he even more stable now than he was a month ago? How do you see the stability of the regime? And just very quickly, please.
Yeah, people are expecting these repressions, but they haven't come so far. And Putin has to tread very carefully around people like Surovikin in the army, because if there is an open investigation, if he's openly thrown in jail, then Putin could face problems in the Russian army, because Prigozhin very clearly enjoyed high support within the army. His kind of corruption allegations played well with the Russian troops in the rank and file. So if he goes after people on his side in the army, then he faces potential collapse in the front, collapse in unity within the army itself. And that, of course, is very dangerous for the operations in Ukraine. And I think, we've never really seen a Putin crack down on anyone who is actually a big player inside his system. We've never seen any government minister or oligarch who is close to his inner circle ever be jailed. Putin has actually always been very timid in that respect. Of course, we've seen people like Khodorkovsky, Alexei Navalny being treated very, very badly indeed and be jailed and face the most repressive tactics, but they are outsiders. Putin has never really gone against one of his own, and we've seen that play out as well as a result of the armed rebellion. So these questions over his authority and in fact his weakness are going to remain.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Catherine. Very clear assessment. So he really gets out weaker and is a weak president, but still strong enough to, of course, continue the war. Benjamin, give us a sense of the upcoming NATO summit and your ideas for the security guarantee. And we are already sort of running well beyond schedule, but please give us a sense how you see that going forward.
Thank you, Guntram, and good morning, everyone. Hint taken on being as brief as possible. I just published this policy brief for DGAP on security guarantees for Ukraine and conclude that extending the Joint Expeditionary Force, the NATO-based mini-alliance, is the best option. Let me explain why. It's an argument that proceeds in 5 steps. 1, it says that NATO is the only medium-term solution for Ukraine, but also for European security more widely. But second step, there's no consensus on that among key allies, particularly in Washington and Berlin. There is resistance to that. And so, because of that, we need an interim solution. And there are several options on the table, which we evaluate in this paper and go through their strengths and weaknesses to then conclude that extending this mini-alliance, the Joint Expeditionary Force, is the one that meets the criteria that we set. And from that, we could actually build and dream a little bigger, go a little further, and really build a European pillar of NATO that would serve Europe's security interests as well as Ukraine's security needs in the medium term. So why is NATO the only option for Ukraine? This has been well covered, but briefly, to ensure that we don't again create a grey zone of the kind that has provoked Russian aggression in the past, grey zones being green lights for dictators, as Kurt Volker put it recently. To offer a sufficient deterrent, we know that NATO is the only real proven deterrent against authoritarian aggression in Europe. To avoid nuclear proliferation, which becomes a danger if Ukraine were to seek to secure itself, having not received sufficient guarantees from the West and learning its own lessons from the Budapest memorandum. But also to bind the West to Ukraine and to ensure that there is a community of shared destiny that actually brings our security needs, aligns our interests and values together in the long term. Why is there no consensus? Well, there's a lot of talk about avoiding escalation, about fearing a direct confrontation with Russia, but that rings a bit false because NATO states have effective deterrents against Russia. We've seen that by being able to cross the Kremlin's red lines time and again on supplying Ukraine with no direct reprisal against NATO states. So the real reason we think behind this is actually in Washington. They don't want to take on another commitment to another European country that they would be on the hook for. So even though the results of this conflict or any potential future conflict fall mainly on Europeans, the burdens for providing security falls mainly on the US still. And so the US wants Europeans on the hook for European security in the longer term. That means an interim option is needed, which must credibly deter Russia. It must be a platform for, not an alternative to, NATO membership for Ukraine. But it also must serve the wider needs of European security. And so of the options on the table, we think a coalition of the willing, particularly one based on the Joint Expeditionary Force, is the best way to go. It offers a much more credible deterrent than the so-called hedgehog option of just arming Ukraine, but not getting directly involved in its defense, which would also create the potential for instability in a number of ways, not only through nuclear proliferation, but by being yet another snub to Ukraine from the West. So it's also a fairly morally questionable position of asking Ukrainians to do the fighting and dying in the name of democracy when we ourselves are not willing to, which further sends negative signals about our own deterrence and willing to fight. I'll leave it there for my initial intervention because that gets you through the key stages of the argument, and then happy to follow up on more on the Jeff and the Jedi in the next hour.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Benjamin. I mean, perhaps you can just say two quick further points. I mean, one is on the timing. I mean, when do we extend this kind of security guarantee? So at what stage of the war? Is it now? Is it, in a ceasefire? Is it in peace settlement or whatever? So that's one. And very quickly, if you have the time, and I mean, then we open up also for the discussion with the colleagues. You saw that the chair of the German Foreign Affairs Committee, Michael Roth, just proposed some sort of partial NATO membership for parts of the Ukrainian territory as a possible solution. I would be really curious to get your reactions to that proposal. Also, I think it's just fresh off the press and of course very controversial. And I'm sure that Nico Lange might want to weigh in on this as well afterwards. So Benjamin, please.
Thanks, Guntram. Yes, so in terms of timing, we were lucky enough to have a discussion with Ukrainian experts as well as German politicians and experts here at the DGAP last night. And everyone was very, including the Ukrainians, reflecting the government position that no one expects Ukraine to join NATO or to be given an effective security guarantee until there is a ceasefire. They are not expecting Western forces to step in and intervene in the conflict as it is. But come a ceasefire, that would be the time when the security guarantee or equivalent of the concrete security offer to Ukraine is needed to kick in. It needs to kick in then so that there's a clear path that could secure Ukraine's investment in reconstruction, that could ensure the peace remains, the ceasefire remains, and provide that path to NATO in the longer run. And a lot of people are expecting that an invitation to join NATO may be offered at the Washington Summit next April, the Washington NATO Summit. So between now and then, some kind of credible security guarantee option has to be in place so that it's ready to go at the time when that invitation might be made. And of course, an invitation doesn't mean you join straight away. It still takes a long time after that. So to cover that interim period, we would need to have that in place. But the very fact of making the offer would be likely to shorten the war, because part of Putin's theory of victory, or the Russians' theory of victory, is to outlast the commitment of the West and to count on the Western war fatigue kicking in, even though we're not suffering from the consequences of the war. So this would be a clear signal that we're in for the long term. We are on the hook for this. We need to defend Ukraine. And so it would be a way of actually shortening the timeline of the war. With regard, very briefly, to Michael Roth's proposal, I was delighted to see this, I have to say, because it's a real step forward in the German debate. And coming from the Social Democrats, it is a clear distinction to the position taken by the Chancellery. So Olaf Scholz has been very clear that he thinks Germany and NATO members should focus on arming Ukraine, the hedgehog option, rather than NATO membership. Robin Wagner from the Greens, who's the chair of the Ukraine German group in the Bundestag, said last night that it should be possible to do both. And this is a step forward to thinking about how. And so partial NATO would actually be a very good way of describing the Jeff proposal that I make and the Jedi proposal, which goes beyond it, the Joint European Defence Initiative. Partial in terms of not all the benefits straight away, not all the structures, not Article 5, but a security guarantee, mutual defence pact from some of the NATO members, the coalition of the willing within NATO who would provide that guarantee. Partial in the other sense, territorially. A lot of people have been making the comparison recently, and Guntram, you and I talked about this, between Germany joining the alliance in 1955, when not in control of all of its territory, West Germany having not had a formal settlement with the DDR at that point. So there is precedent there in some ways for a partial territorial entry. But of course, there are differences in context as well. Think of the amount of troops in West Germany at the time from the Allies, for one thing.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks, Benjamin. And I do want to get Nico's reaction to the proposal of Michael Roth. And Catherine, I would love to have also your reactions, in particular to the question how you think Russia would react to a forceful guarantee that would be given in the Vilnius Summit. Because, of course, Russia, falsely or not, has always been claiming, and Putin has always been claiming, that it is exactly the extension of NATO that is the reason why they entered the war in the first place. So wouldn't that reinforce also Putin's position within the Russian context? So perhaps we can get the two of you to react to that point, and then let me really invite our audience to start raising your hands, put your questions in the chat, so that we start having a conversation here. Thank you so much. Nico, please.
Well, first of all, I believe if Sweden is not joining NATO at Vilnius, if Ukraine is not invited to NATO, and if there is no a clear understanding of forward defense at the eastern flank, then the NATO summit at Vilnius will not be a success. And I start with this because I think there is the real danger that we will not be really successful in Vilnius. I know that a NATO summit is always successful just because it happened, but in the eyes of Russia, I think Sweden not joining and Ukraine not being invited could look like a sign of weakness from the NATO side. That's very important. When it comes to this proposal by Michael Roth, well, there is the German precedent, not only in 1955, by the way, that there was also a special regulation for the Saarland. And the interesting part is the combination of national legislation, Article 23 of the Basic Law, and the special requirements for the Saarland with the Saar Statute that later failed, because it made possible that the area that was not part of Germany in 1955 later joined Germany, but also became member of NATO that way when Saarland joined the Federal Republic of Germany. And having an arrangement where Ukraine is member of NATO, excluding some territories, but automatically the territories would join later when they are joining Ukraine again. I think it's intellectually, I think it's a very good way to move the debate forward. But of course, membership of Ukraine in NATO is not only a question on what criteria Ukraine should fulfill. If you look at the territory of Ukraine, if you look at the coasts of the Black Sea, if you try to imagine a NATO force posture that would give credibility to Article 5 on this territory, is it a partial territory or the full territory of Ukraine? It is a challenging task for NATO. And it has to be a credible security guarantee. That's why I believe also we would need time to build a military posture to actually be ready to defend Ukraine when it becomes a member of NATO. And one last sentence. I was at the Ukraine Recovery Conference some time ago in London. What I understood from private investors is that they will not invest into Ukraine recovery when there is no security guarantee. And the only security guarantee that they know that works on the European continent is membership in NATO. So also from that angle, I think the situation will continue. And I mean, if you look at the alternatives of having Ukraine a member of NATO or arming Ukraine to the teeth so that it can deter the Western military district of Russia by itself, the second option is much more expensive. It's much cheaper to have Ukraine in NATO than to try to arm Ukraine and have an inflow of 40, 50, 60 billion euro into Ukrainian military every year just to make Ukraine be able to defend itself. So from an economic point of view, NATO membership makes much more sense to me.
Thank you, Nico. Indeed, credible deterrence is the cheaper option, but as you point out, it has to be credible and it has to be well organized. But Catherine, give us a sense of how this would be perceived in Moscow.
I think in Moscow, there's already been a great deal of perturbance over some of the proposals. I mean, not just to have security guarantees, but just the idea of even having a guaranteed supply of arms every year over a multi-year period, this so-called porcupine defense strategy, even that is raising some hackles in the Kremlin. I was told by one of the members of Russian diplomatic circles, well, you know, we launched this war to demilitarize Ukraine, and obviously that's the opposite of what's going to happen if Ukraine gets this steady and continual supply of weapons. And he said, well, surely this will mean that we'll just have to double down our efforts in the war. Since then, however, this same person who's very much on the kind of the dovish side of the fence is perhaps hoping that these type of arrangements or even the discussions on the broader security guarantees for Ukraine could provide an opening for peace talks and negotiations. I actually spoke with him last night, and he was saying that, well, if Zelensky gets to walk away from Vilnius with some very clear commitments from NATO, then perhaps he can go back to his population and sell it to them. Look, this is what we've gotten out of the war. The counteroffensive isn't going great. You know, we're going to lose a lot of our population. But if we have some kind of ceasefire and agree some kind of partial withdrawal, perhaps by Russia, I mean, obviously that still seems a bit pie in the sky. Then perhaps it would be a basis for negotiations, because at least Zelensky would have something to tell the population. This is what we've gotten out of the invasion. We have these concrete guarantees from the West, but obviously it's a long way to get there. And also why we should take Russia's word in those type of negotiations is also questionable, because of course, as we've discussed before, there are those in the more hawkish camp who would take any ceasefire or any pause just as an opportunity to rearm, and without full membership of NATO, then the security guarantees on won't necessarily mean anything to Russia either. So, I mean, the long and short of it is that within the Kremlin, there's no clarity either. People don't know what Putin wants or how he would react, but they are looking for openings through Vilnius.
Wonderful. So let me bring in Klaus Wittmann, and please do raise your hands or put your questions in the chat so that we are having an interactive discussion here. Herr Wittmann, please.
Good morning. I would like to remark and ask the following. Nico Lange's good explanation made very clear why the expectations of many people for a quick, successful offensive were totally unrealistic. Supervised minefields in open terrain, fortifications, and local air superiority. What continues to make me bitter is the awareness that our failure to give Ukraine in the autumn the means to maintain and intensify the momentum of the counterattacks around Kharkiv and Kherson has made it possible for Russia to prepare so strong defenses over many months. And now a question to Nico on the morale of the Russian troops. Do you think that they are aware of Prigozhin's diatribe about motives for and conduct of the war? No threat from NATO, no fascists in the Ukrainian leadership, no massacres in the Donbass, reason for the war, Shoigu's ambitions, dilettantic conduct of the war, huge losses not known in Russia, etc., etc. If I were the Ukrainian leadership, I would make every effort to use every channel and media that would reach the Russian troops and commanders to spread those points, asking, do you want to continue to die for that? What do you think?
First of all, I can only underline what you said about us being too slow to deliver what has been needed by Ukraine. But what is increasingly frustrating is that we are not learning from this. Because again, there is slow rolling going on, and not only from Germany, also from the United States, which always gives Russia time, even in a moment when Russia has a temporary moment of weakness, to rebuild and to regroup, while everybody understands from a military point of view, when Russia has a moment of weakness, you have to push to finish this. This is very frustrating, and I see a reluctancy on the political levels, and that includes the US, to follow the military logic here. So there is wishful thinking that you can now somehow politically decide the end of the war, but it has to be militarily decided, and there is still a reluctance to accept this. And this unfolds also when it comes to production capabilities. We are not producing enough to sustain the Ukrainian war effort. And just because there were papers written about ammunition, it does not mean that more ammunition is produced now. And we are always happy with ourselves when there is a paper out, but the ammunition is not there yet. And that's true also for other things. So that's a frustrating thing. When it comes to morale, the ordinary Russian soldier has no mobile phone at this point, at least in most units, and is indoctrinated very, very intensively. So I'm not really sure what they know. I think it's that on the commanders level, Russians are discussing what was going on. And also that the quality of Russian units is very diverse. And I think it has been an attempt by Ukraine to find out where the weaker military units are. Because the battle-hardened Russian units, they will not panic with Ukrainian attacks. They will stay and hold the line. And so far, I think we have to just soberly understand Ukraine was not able to figure out where the weaker Russian units are, and was not able to produce panic on the other side. We might see this unfolding when Ukraine tries bigger attacks, when they have reduced the helicopters and artillery so that they can try to have bigger push, but we will see. Mm-hmm. On the Ukrainian side, I mean, I know that, just one more sentence, Guntram, I know we are short on time, but on the Ukrainian side, in the military, there is great approval for Valery Zaluzhny's prudent and cautious approach to this. So while with some Western partners and some, especially people in the media, there's always this idea, why is Ukraine not pushing and they should move faster and so on, Ukrainian soldiers appreciate that their commander-in-chief is trying to go slow, try to save material, try to focus on the rescue chain. And by the way, the quota of injured to killed in the Ukrainian armed forces is very professional now. So they save their soldiers, they stop the bleedings, they move them out, they treat them. So this careful resource management, if you want to call it like this has high approval within Ukraine, but it contradicts Western views and Western media views on the war, and that is where the discussion is unfolding at the moment.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nico, and thanks again also for emphasizing the point about ammunition production and weapon production, which is still lagging behind. It's a huge issue. We've been talking about it, and as think tankers, all we can do is write papers and do podcasts with it or YouTube videos. But I do think this is an issue not just in Germany but overall in the West. In a war of attrition, Russia has a lot of weapon production capacities, and so this is quite a dangerous road to go into a very long, prolonged war without actually being able to ramp up the production quickly enough. So I know that there is already 2 comments in the chat that I think are to Benjamin, and I hope you read them, but I do want, and you can answer them directly, but I do want to bring in also the 3 hands that were raised. So Nikolai von Schöpf, then David Bailey, and then Milanic.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much for this interesting briefing. I have one point to General Zaluzhny, the chief of staff of the Ukrainian army, he gave a long interview this week in the Washington Post, and he was very skeptical about the success, about the Ukrainian offensive. He says, on the one hand, 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers die every day, and he needs urgently artillery. He says the Russians have 10 times more. And then fighter planes. He asked for 1/3 of NATO fighter planes stations on the east line of NATO states. And he says if the Ukrainian army doesn't get them, he doesn't see any success of the summer offensive. And he says he's in constant exchange with General Milley. And if we remember correctly, Milley was also very skeptical already in November last year about the success. Thank you.
Thank you. David Bailey, please.
On the ability of the West to keep up with ammunition supplies in particular, I'm a little bit more optimistic because surely the measuring stick here is the ability of Russia to keep up supplies of its ammunition as well. Is that not a factor? That was the first point. The second point was the timescales. So I think that the media is very guilty of placing unrealistic timescales on the Ukrainian offensive, and from my perspective, at least, it's going slowly for the reasons that have been discussed, but it's going slowly in a very sensible way, which I think are also points that have been discussed. And so the overall presentation of this as being longer than expected, I think, is unrealistic given the situation on the ground. And the real question here is about media presentation of the issue, rather than any military appraisal of what the situation is on the ground and how long this kind of offensive really needs to take. And on the third point, the morale of the troops on either side, again, you've covered the points that on the Russian side, there's a terrible morale. We're seeing people blow themselves up in trenches and turning up in Ukrainian captivity in a terrible state. Do the factors of Russian supply and Russian morale not play into Ukraine's favor in the war moving forward?
Thank you so much. And then let's take Milan.
Yes, good morning. I have two questions, both of them on the Vilnius Summit. Let's go back to actually the main point of this briefing. One is to Nico Lange, who knows something about Ukrainian political sort of tactique, also how they are trying to influence our own decision making. If you were in the advisory team of President Zelensky, what would be your advice in the last remaining days, how to influence the outcome to their favor? Can we expect some surprising move, including, for instance, President Zelensky coming in person to Vilnius? And a second question is on Sweden, and I would address it to Benjamin. As we heard how decision on Sweden, there will be no ratification, of course, but at least political decision is important for the overall outcome and also for perception in Moscow. How do you see the last-minute negotiations with Turkey that Stoltenberg is trying to convene? Can we still have a political decision on the membership and changing of mind from Turkey and Hungary at Vilnius?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Milan. And just for those of you who don't know Milan is a senior fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations and is really also instrumental in putting this morning briefing together with a few colleagues. We have a weekly discussion, what comes next. And so Milan is really one of the thought leaders there. So thank you so much, Milan. So let's, I would say we have enough questions for the last 10 minutes. I would say, Catherine, we start perhaps with you. I mean, there was a question certainly on the journalists and the news industry. So you might want to react, being the only journalist in the room, you might want to react to that. But then I'm sure you want to pick up on some of the other questions as well.
Yeah, I do think it's been a problem in the way that it's been covered, but I would say in defense of my colleagues, it's not only coming from the journalists, but it's also been coming from politicians who speak to journalists, who speak about how expectations are high. But yes, unfortunately, there is this tendency to overhype counteroffensives. Of course, people have been expecting it for a long time. And then there was the added pressure of all the talk as well around the US election, that Ukraine essentially had to show progress before the primaries began in November, because people believed that Biden didn't want to go into the primaries with the war still continuing. So this all escalated into a bubble which should never have existed. And I think it's been great that people like Nico and Ben have been pointing out all the kind of difficulties that Ukraine is facing in terms of the preparedness of the Russian defenses and the lack of ammunition supplies, which takes me to the point of Russian ammunition supplies. I think, unfortunately, Russia has been much more focused on these issues than the Western economies have. All Russia has been doing for the last year and a half has been trying to kind of direct its industry to really launch a mobilization of industry to make sure there are adequate supplies of ammunition and shells to the Russian military. We've seen these huge increases in Russian defense spending. It went up 26 billion in just January and February alone this year. We've heard reports of Russian plants working round the clock to get these supplies to the front line. And I'm afraid the West is kind of failing in comparison. I mean, of course, we've had the EU initiative to put in €1 billion into ensuring adequate ammo supplies, but that, as far as I'm aware, is yet to translate into adequate orders. The US is ramping up shell production, but it's still far from the level that Ukraine requires.
Thank you so much. Indeed, the Russian war economy is in full steam, I would say, and that's of course not the case. I mean, we don't need a war economy in the West, but we need some redirection of resources to military production. And also, the German budgetary debate now shows how difficult it is to sort of just establish a simple principle of dedicating 2% per year in defense spending. So we do have an issue here. So let me turn to Benjamin for your reaction. Also in the chat there were 2 or 3 points to you. Perhaps you can quickly react to them as well.
With pleasure. Thank you, Guntram, and thank you to everyone for the comments and questions, engaging so thoughtfully with the debate today. One quick point to something that Catherine mentioned, and then on to the questions. I think it's really important that we don't continue to fall into the trap of giving Russia a voice, a vote, or a veto on NATO enlargement or enlargement of the EU, or in fact our policy of any other kind. That's been the case in the past. That has tripped us up. Dancing around the concerns of a dictatorship has got us into part of the mess we're in, and we can't repeat that mistake. So we should make the best decision for NATO, which is enlargement of a sphere of integration, voluntary by the countries that want to join, rather than being the Russian-style sphere of influence. That's exactly what we should be standing up against. So I think it's important to emphasize that when we think about how Russia reacts to these decisions. To Joachim Kleinschmidt, who asked a question in the chat about what is the JEDI and what does it do for the various countries involved? Why would they want to become? So Joint European Defence Initiative, I think, solves a lot of problems for some of the big players in European security. The UK is running up against some of the contradictions of its own economic problems brought upon itself to a significant degree. But has talked an extremely good game and has provided thought leadership, has provided steps forward in supporting Ukraine that others were unwilling to take. However, as I say, it's running up against its limits of doing that. So sharing the leadership with another major power, another major nuclear-armed power in Europe, such as France, would be extremely appealing. It also fits with the change of mood in London since the Sunak premiership started of wanting to cooperate more with European partners, particularly on security, and the Franco-British summit in March pointed to that as well. So I think there's willingness there. There's willingness potentially in Paris because the wind has really changed there. The move from understanding France's contribution to strategic autonomy, instead seeing a question of strategic ability and exercising leadership with or through NATO, rather than in competition to it, has been a major shift. That comes hand in hand with the need to build trust in Central and Eastern Europe, which is no secret at all, and the need to take concrete steps to do so. And forming this kind of initiative, together with the Brits who lend credibility in Central and Eastern Europe, would be one way to do that. And that requires a common European position on this. And so a coalition of the willing would really have to be able to get together what it is they're going to give in a way that would be credible. They would have to agree that JEF or Jedi troops would do exercises and maneuvers in Ukraine. This is something that's made the JEF very successful in the past, is getting those boots on the ground and potentially providing a tripwire type deterrent. Lastly, it works for Poland as well, who would be another big player in this. Their massive rearmament, their capable ground force that they're building. Imagine that together with Ukraine's, put it together with the air power that is provided by a lot of the Western members of this alliance, and the nuclear, therefore full spectrum capability that the US and France bring to the equation, and you have something of a credible deterrent. As to Germany, that's the moment of truth. If this happens, then Germany needs to decide what kind of player is it, what kind of power is it? Can it act as a team in concert with others? Last comment to Philip, who asked a question as well. Are good intentions enough to overcome the conditions of actually getting countries into our organizations? I think we have to recognize the geopolitical significance of these developments and the need to move at that speed of relevance for those developments, rather than getting caught in this restrictive comfort of legalism that traps us in old rules.
Wonderful. Thank you, Benjamin. Before I give the last word to Nico, let me just say we will, after this, have a summer break and resume on 24th of August. It's the day of Ukrainian independence. That's going to be our first morning briefing after the summer break. Nico, please react to the last few points, including also the question perhaps by Dominic Torkstorff on the US and perhaps differences between the Biden administration and the military leadership. Is there on how cautiously and how strongly one should support Ukraine?
Yes, I will try to answer that. Before, let me do a short parenthesis on our back and forth, Guntram, on production capabilities. What I find important to stress is that for supporting the war effort of Ukraine, for future security guarantees for Ukraine, for strengthening the European pillar within NATO, production capabilities of European arms productions are key. It's not only the spending, it is the production capabilities and the technological capabilities. I think it's really, really important. And we are too slow, and it is not done what is necessary at the moment. On the war in Ukraine and the wishful thinking or the media, I think this stems from the wish by many people that the war is to be over. So we wish for a quick counteroffensive or somehow this ending. And from the beginning, this has been political thinking, this has to be over soon. It will not be over soon. And we have to, I think, be very careful as partners of Ukraine that we do not create the impression that we want the war to end because we are so affected by the war. We are not the ones affected by the war. It's the Ukrainians who are affected by the war. I understand everybody in Germany, saying, I do not want to have the pictures of the war on my TV screen because I want to have holidays now. But this is the wrong approach to this. But we meet this very often. If you look into the military campaign, I think Zelensky had from the very beginning a military planning to continue the current campaign, the counteroffensive as we call it, well into next year. So still, they seized the initiative, and now there is a Ukrainian plan to continue into spring 24. And if this will not be successful, there will not be an end, because I think Ukraine then will accumulate resources and plan the next campaign and continue with the next campaign. I think this is the reality we are facing. This is a long war. It will continue, and let's do what is necessary from our side to support the long effort. The Ukrainians, with an overwhelming majority, they want to continue fighting. This will not stop. soon. On the US, I think, I think the US, I think, I think the US, 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 I think the I think the Pentagon has been quite good, and the military has been quite good to expand the boundaries of what is possible and what is not possible. But there are still a lot of restrictions coming from the White House directly. I have the suspicion sometimes the Pentagon even used the British friends who have a tendency of being more forward-leaning, see Storm Shadow and other elements to push the boundaries of what is possible. But I think there's still this elementary idea of avoiding escalation that I'm really puzzled by, because it's not really clear to me what instruments Putin could possibly have to escalate things. But this thinking is still there, and there's a political thinking in Washington, D.C. that somehow that the war should not be part of the election year 2024. And that's where I really do not understand. I mean, if you do not want the war to be part of election year in 2024, then give Ukraine the resources now to end this in 2023. But not giving Ukraine the resources and still wanting this to end, it doesn't seem to be very logical to me. But that is the approach. On the NATO summit, maybe just that's my final remark. Surprises are possible. I think last minute surprises are more the usual thing when it comes to those summits. And if the top bureaucrats are not able to come to agreements, then the question has to be passed up to the principals, and they have to talk directly and find solutions. And that always happens just in the days before. I think we will see some of that. What I would really love to see, except from Sweden's membership, is if the NATO-Ukraine Commission could not only be reinstated, but upgraded to a NATO-Ukraine Council, and if then the NATO-Ukraine Council could be tasked to forward a report on Ukrainian membership to the Washington Summit, so that we at least could transfer this into a process that is a progress in comparison to what has been decided in Bucharest long ago. I think we need something that is much, much stronger than that. Security guarantees, that's my last point. Security guarantees and NATO declaration are separate things. I think everybody involved in this will make clear that bilateral security guarantees by individual countries or a declaration on security guarantees, it's not a NATO issue. It will be maybe the G7 plus other countries passing a declaration in parallel to the NATO summit, and then we have to figure out what is in this declaration and what is in the NATO declaration and how does it fit together for Ukraine. But I think it's clear to me it's not a NATO, and maybe that's for the better if other countries can be dragged in. I saw with interest that in the meeting Andrej Yermak had in Copenhagen recently, there were also representatives of Brazil and of China present. So that could be an interesting element of dragging some of those countries into the or more toward the Ukrainian side. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I mean, I would love to actually extend this briefing for another hour because there's so much to discuss. But unfortunately, we really want to stick to 1 hour. And really, I want to use this opportunity now to thank our speakers. This was really a wonderful and really so thoughtful and to the point briefing. And thank you, our audience, for listening and for engaging in the discussion. And I really look forward to seeing you back on August 24. Mark your calendars already. It's going to be an important coming back after the summer. And until then, have a great break. Thank you so much for following us on this and any other geopolitical issues at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.